So, greetings all. Welcome to the Powerhouse Perspective, empowering leaders for business breakthroughs. If you're watching us on YouTube, you're going to recognize that once again we're on Zoom today as we continue our discussion of wisdom in the AI age. Before I introduce our guest, those who may be new to the pod, I'm Scott Medeiros. I am the president of Helmwise, and my co-host is Mr. Chandler Rose, the CEO of the Rosewood family of companies. Chandler, perhaps a wave or a hello?
Hey, great to be here. I love this series we're doing on wisdom in the age of AI and excited about having our guests today and our continued discussions around this topic.
Outstanding. So as I mentioned, we're going to continue our discussion of wisdom in the AI age. And today our guest is Mr. Michael Graham, who is program director of the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics at the Gospel Coalition, which, if you're not familiar with the Gospel Coalition, it's the largest evangelical website in the world. So a short bio on Michael. Prior to his time at the Gospel Coalition, he was actually the executive pastor at Orlando Grace Church and also CFO of a mobile software company called Allogy. And they did a lot of work with then the Department of Defense, now known as obviously the Department of War, but also with the Pentagon and with the Veterans Administration. So he's very well knowledgeable of our military landscape. In addition to that, and most importantly, Michael is the founder of the AI Christian Benchmark and also the co-founder of Religion Data. So in those aspects, he is the perfect guest for us to continue our discussion of wisdom in the AI age. Now, Michael, our listeners know, those who at least have been listening to us for a while, understand that we have what we call the Helmwise methodology. And one of our tenets of the Helmwise methodology is an acronym called OAR, O-A-R. So obviously, Helmwise is sort of a nautical theme, and OAR fit very well. But OAR actually stands for Orient, Align, and Reckon. And we think it's very important during any conversation, during any decision-making exercise, that you properly orient, and then you align with the people who are around the table, or perhaps those partners that you're working with, and then you reckon. You're constantly making these adjustments en route to your next waypoint, your ultimate destination. So with that, I'd like to kick it off with orientation. And one of the key things about wisdom is truth. And so, in your opinion, what is truth?
Yeah, truth has two facets to it for me and from my perspective. So, the big word for this is, epistemology, which is, like, what is the theory of knowledge, that you have. So the epistemological grid that I come from has two facets to it, and they're called general revelation and special revelation. Special revelation is the sum total of all things that we know only through God's word as revealed in the Bible. And general revelation is the sum total of all things that are true, where you don't need to have any knowledge of, special revelation, the Bible, any of those kinds of things. So truth comes at us from both of those two avenues. So it's not like, only religious people or only Christians have truth. There's all sorts of things that are true. And so having a good epistemology means having a nice balance of general revelation and special revelation. And sometimes each of those two things help you understand the other.
Yeah, outstanding. Chandler?
Yeah, in our view, the way we would translate it sort of in the Helmwise business, we refer to the capital T and the lowercase t. So uppercase, lowercase. And so that would be analogous to your wisdom coming from the word and relationship. And one of the other things we've introduced here is that, we're going to approach this conversation certainly from a Christian worldview. And as we talked about on a previous podcast, we share that worldview, but we'll do our best to talk about how that translates into leading people who don't share the Christian worldview, which Michael just did a great job of talking about. There's certainly truth that is not what we would just call capital T, uppercase T. That is relevant and it's out there and people operate around. And so I think that's important to lay out and gives a framework of which lever we're pulling on more. And so when we talk about wisdom and we want to define that, we talk about really how do we orient what's highest to us.
Yeah.
And we've talked about this previously. And then how do you order that? So if that's whatever you hold most dear, if that's your religious tradition, if that's God, Christian God is what we share in this discussion, And then you start ordering the things below that of family and business and, whatever it may be in that order. And then when we talk about aligning it, do you have values, a set of values that you align to? And one of the reasons we push on that, and we think that is a kind of universal thing to talk about, is we don't have to share the same belief. We call it triangulation. And Scott spoken on it. We had a discussion with John Stonestreet. I don't need you to, I may like it if you hold the same thing at the highest and you order it the same and you have the same alignment of values. But at least if you have some, we don't have to agree. We can measure, here's how I would approach it, here's how you would approach it. And together we can make progress. Here's where we differ, here's where we're the same. And I can hold you accountable to what you claim is highest, how you order yourself and what you're accountable to, and vice versa. You can hold us accountable. And so that allows us to do business. It allows us to, I have lots of friends that don't share my belief at all, who aren't Christians, who, may have beliefs that are actually counter to some of my sincere ones. To me, that's an easy discussion. If we reach those topics, obviously it can get a little bit interesting, but they at least stand for something. And so I think one of the, contentions we make is if you don't have wisdom and you don't have something that orients and orders and aligns you, it's pretty hard to be wise. Now, you can be right. What are your thoughts on kind of how we lay that out in our view of business?
There's a really, really sharp Dutch thinker from a little over 100 years ago named Herman Bavinck. And Bavinck talked a lot about this idea of sphere sovereignty. And the idea of sphere sovereignty is society is made up of all of these smaller spheres. And so the most basic unit of society is obviously the family unit. And then you have all these other spheres that work their way up from those different institutions. And all of those different institutions, they have to navigate and negotiate relationships with each other. And sometimes, the perspectives that you get in between, from one institution or another, or one sphere to another, each one of those spheres has its role in culture and society. And so the key is making sure that each of those spheres, kind of stays in its lane. And also that there has to be a level of charity in culture and society in terms of how we navigate our respective spheres. And so that, the way that we relate to each other requires tremendous wisdom, and particularly when there's places where there's maybe more friction or higher, a higher grit sandpaper, or I get lower grit sandpaper, get that 36, grit out, when people have different perspectives. So, in the book of Proverbs in the Bible, it talks about how the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So I do think that there is, just like there's lowercase t and capital, uppercase T as well. I think there's also, kind of lowercase w and uppercase W. And there's wisdom that you can have without any, knowledge of, any knowledge of God and those kinds of things. A lot of those things come from experiences. They come from expertise. There's a relationship there with knowledge, but there's also another layer of wisdom, I think, that's, kind of uppercase, that can be really helpful when you gain access to, having fear of God, and those things can help form and shape you with respect to your virtues, your principles, and the way that you relate to and treat other people.
And as we continue to lay out, and I think you're 100% accurate there, the uppercase, lowercase distinction, I think it segues well into AI. So what is AI actually giving us when it says that it's, this is the answer, this is truth? How is it getting that answer? When we talk about orient, when you put a prompt, you put a question into AI, or if you're trying to build out a workflow, you're trying to do something in a business, how is it actually arranging? Actually, is it going out and getting the information, not necessarily fact, but information? And then how does that form into a truth? Do you want to give your kind of quick discussion of how you see AI responding in many of those cases.
Yeah. Okay. So AIs are, this is a subset of machine learning. Machine learning is a field that's been around for over 60 years. What's different about machine learning today is that the amount of compute, in other words, how many processes that we can do, is a lot more than what it was even, 3 or 5 years ago. And so the technology's been there for a while to do this. It's just that the compute really hadn't caught up. And so machine learning, or artificial intelligence, or large language models, are basically input-output machines. You dump a bunch of words, numbers, images, or video in, and it trains on that, and it learns patterns. So as it pertains to large language models, you put a bunch of words in, say the entire internet, the sum total of everything that's been non-copyrighted, you put all those words in. And what the machine learning, what the large language model does is it notices statistical probabilities of when certain types of words end up appearing very close to each other. And so over time, when it's been trained on all of that, it's just words plus statistics. And so what isn't happening is necessarily reasoning or these kinds of things. It's just really, really dialed in statistical probabilities such that it looks like natural language. And so because of the amount of compute that's there, it ends up looking really, really good. But really, what's and this is whatever AI is today, it will never be worse than what it is today. And so the technology will just get better and better. So as an input-output machine, it's no different also than what our moms all told us when we were kids. So in any input-output machine, and in some ways, I don't want to call humans a machine, but there's a sense in which what our moms told us of garbage in, garbage out is true. And the same thing is also true. If you put, wisdom in, you'll get wisdom out. And so a lot of, how we should think about AI really boils down to, well, how do we use it as a tool? And so there is a lot of garbage that's in there. The models have done a decent job at trying to filter out as much of that garbage as what they can. But that gets into, well, who decides what filters there are, what values are behind those filters, and those kinds of things. So, in many ways, what we get out of AI is going to be largely determined by how we ask the questions and prompts that we ask, and which models we choose to use, and what are the underlying values that kind of stand as filters between what you've asked and what comes back to you in the output.
And I think we discussed on this podcast a few times interpolation and the patterns and the probabilities when it's looking across domains and it's taking all the info that it's embedded into the space. And we've talked about the limitations of patterns versus moving into extrapolation, where you move into areas it doesn't have a match or a similarity that's a high enough probability to be useful. So you ask it a question, it doesn't have enough data sets that are known parameters within that. It starts getting into hallucinations. So we've talked about that divide a little bit. We'll talk some more today about, when we leave it being a great pattern spotting machine, something is a huge advancement that's going to change the world, certainly. But then when do you move to does it apply in this unique situation versus even if I get it the right answer, which is where I would argue you move to wisdom, should I deploy that answer and when? And is it in alignment with our values? And it's kind of 3 steps. I think what's interesting, looking at some of your work and discussions, is we know about parameters. We know about training. I think most people understand they're doing that. We know there's some throttling and kind of the algorithm of whether we want it to be less provocative, more, hey, even if that's a truth, do I give that truth? Because I know it's going to cause problems. But I heard you speak on the amount humans are still filtering and impacting outputs. And I don't think that we've discussed on any of our podcasts how much humans are meddling even past training parameters and talking more filters that are being human-led. Can you give a little info on what you found when you were doing your analysis?
Yeah, so there's three things that are important here in terms of human involvement. The first is model weights, the second is alignment protocols, and the third thing is citation preferences. And they kind of form a Venn diagram that overlap a little bit with each other. Let me kind of try to explain each at a very, very high level and then explain where the humans are in it. Before I do that, though, what's important to understand is why these things are necessary. First, they're necessary because in that training data, there's a lot of garbage. Stuff on how to commit crimes, stuff on how to kill yourself, how to make IEDs, ricin, anthrax, all sorts of problematic things that we would not want, people to use. And so filters especially alignment protocols will always have to exist. Also, every platform has to decide that not every piece of information in the training data is equally trustworthy or equally valuable. And so you have to, that ends up manifesting itself in preferences of certain things that you end up citing over other things. Just like Google has page rank and, in SEO, there's something that, that's kind of like what citation preference is. And then those things also go back to model weights. But so imagine how a platform like Grok, which has heavy citation preferences to Reddit and to Twitter or X, that would produce results that would be very different than a platform that's very much tuned to Wikipedia in terms of citation preferences. And so different parts of your training sets might lend themselves to different perspectives on all sorts of different things. And so those things end up taking on the character of the responses ends up reflecting the citation preferences. Okay, put that aside for a second. Where the heavy human decisions come in is primarily under alignment protocols. And so alignment, you can think about this as almost like a water treatment facility where, stuff comes in, there's all sorts of stuff that needs filtered out, and it goes through all different, an entire workflow of things to make it usable again on the other side of it. Okay. And so that's a pretty good analogy for, what's going on. And most of the models have about a 12 to 15 step process of what comes in and 12 to 15 steps of alignment. So imagine you have what's called the context window, that rectangle where you put in your prompt and you hit enter. Well, what happens after you hit enter and before anything shows up on your screen is there's a ton of compute. And the first thing that happens is, whatever you asked gets translated into something that the model can understand. And so it basically is it rewords what you're asking. It wraps its mind around, the question, and then it begins crunching on that question. And then it begins to go through all sorts of those iterative alignment filters. It might go through 3 or 4 of them and go back to the beginning. And it might check its work and go back to the beginning. It might, then it might go through filters 5 through 8. And then, and there's, every prompt is going to look different in terms of that, but it has its alignment filters. Now, here's the deal. Why do I rehearse all that? Okay, only 4 of the models I'm aware of actually publish white papers on how these alignment protocols work. So you can read on alignment papers on GPT, Claude, Gemini, and DeepSeek. And typically, this is older versions of those models where they explain their alignment protocols. Anyways, if you go and read the 1,000 pages of white papers and all those alignment protocols, and I have, you'll learn that there's about 36 different types of alignment filters. And of those 36 different types of alignment filters, 32 of those types are human generated. So what that means is if there's and if you want to see the flowcharts for all this, we made the flowcharts for all of these on christianbenchmark.ai to make, so you don't have to read all those white papers. You can see the flowcharts on christianbenchmark.ai website for free. And so the challenge with all those filters because they're human generated, and there's all sorts of different types of them. That means that humans kind of imported all of everything in their experiences, all of their values. Well, how do you determine what should or should not be filtered out in a particular thing? Well, you have to make decisions. Some of those decisions are ethical. Some of those decisions are epistemological. Some of those decisions, are things that involve competencies that are well beyond the realm of computer science. And so here's the thesis. There's just a lot more humans involved in your AI than what you understand. And so that isn't necessarily a nefarious thing. I don't think that the people who are doing this there's nothing conspiratorial about all of that. I think all of it is well-intentioned, from every different model. But there are more humans that stand between the context window and the answer than what you understand. It is not just a mechanical process, from an omniscient computer.
Very good. I mean, definitely a few strings and ways you can go down that. First of all, what does that matter to a CEO?
Well, what you have to understand is when the most dominant models in the world all come out of one city, in one country, in one part of the world, well, there can be weaknesses with that. And there can be biases that come from that. And the other part of that is the people who are making those decisions might not be experts in ethics, or might not be experts in religion or epistemological things. And so I think over time, those corporations will get the right people that they need in those seats and fine tune some of those things over time. But from a kind of like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, most of these platforms have been most concerned with making sure that people don't commit terrorist activity or crimes or harm themselves, through their models. And they haven't quite gotten to the place where, oh, well, how does the model handle faith? Or how does the model handle certain business verticals and those different kinds of things? So I think that there's stuff that is still, is still a little immature on the tech as it pertains to that part of the tech stack.
Yeah, Michael, that makes great sense. So as I was thinking about it, as you were going through, and Chandler kind of touched on it, what does that mean to a CEO? I think one of the biggest concerns, and I also believe that you may share this, is the fact that if we're using AI as a decision maker, in other words, whatever AI puts out to me based on the question or the prompt that I put in, I'm going to take action based off of that. So in other words, it is acting as a guide or even as a director of my life, where we need to see the information coming out of AI as just that, being information that we now got to apply the human element to it of wisdom and move forward. Now, we come from a world, all of us here on this call, where we've got education and experience, and we've done those things. But as the world goes faster and people believe that we don't need the formal education process, and I am smarter with AI than Einstein was, so to speak, it starts to get very, very scary. Because to your point about the wastewater treatment plant, there's still a lot of junk that is out there. And if people are making decisions, or more importantly, taking action based off of that, that's a very real threat. So how does a person, in your opinion, kind of combat that? Do you use multiple tools? Do you use tools against itself? What's perhaps a practical way that someone, knowing what you know about these filters, about these alignment protocols, that we can mitigate at least as best we can right now? What's your suggestion?
Okay, I'm going to start theoretical, and then I'm going to go practical.
Okay.
So here's a foundational principle. Knowledge. So think about the supply-demand curve. An inverse curve. Knowledge is getting cheap, and wisdom is getting more expensive. And so the LLMs are really good at knowledge. They are not great at wisdom. And in my mind, actually, LLMs are not capable of wisdom, because I have a somewhat of a circular definition for wisdom that requires embodiment. So you have to have embodiment and experience in order to possess wisdom. And so, wisdom is knowledge applied through personality and experience. And so you can't get something out of this that it can't provide. A glass can only spill what it contains, and the AI contains knowledge. It doesn't contain wisdom. You have to take all of those informations and outputs and contextualize them based on everything that you know and everything that you've experienced in your life. And so actionability has to happen only through wisdom. So you have to, you're the ultimate filter of all of that. All right, so let me get down to brass tacks in terms of, okay, I'm a business leader, and how do I use this tool effectively? There's something brand new in most of these models that is really, really important to understand, that unless you've been paying extremely close attention to the developments, you wouldn't know about yet. And I don't know if have you guys talked at all about skills.markdown files yet?
Not on here.
We have internally, but not on the pod.
Okay. All right. So markdown files are kind of like an instruction manual, and almost like your own alignment filter that you get to put on top of the model at the very end. And so imagine you have a very specific set of principles. You have very specific things in your business. Maybe those are business principles. Maybe those are ideological principles. Maybe those are workflow or process type things. You can basically create your own markdown file, which is basically almost like an instruction manual or a filter that you force all these big models to have to go through. And this is brand new because, and it's incredible, because now the model that was just general before, you're basically forcing it to work through your grid and your priorities and your values. And so I think the single most important thing in terms of maximizing the output on large language models right now, or even agentic AI, is putting together a really excellent skills.markdown, so skills.md file for your business. And so, in my world, which is, on creating resources for Protestants and evangelicals, well, I want Christians around the world to be able to get theologically reliable answers and theologically accurate answers and thorough answers out of these platforms. So you don't get that right now, and you can't expect that out of platforms that are all based from this one city that weren't put together largely by Christians. But what you can do is you can make a skills.markdown file that basically says, hey, anytime there's something that's values or theology or belief centric, I want you to make your answers consistent with the Gospel Coalition Foundation documents and the New City Catechism. And so now you've bolted on this additional filter through this skills.markdown file, which then now the model has to go through that before it gives you any of its outputs. So if you have very clear principles, and especially written principles, your mission, vision, values, or ways that you like to see, if you have a system, or all that kind of stuff, you can put all that stuff in your skills.markdown file, and now the outputs will not only align with where you're at ideologically, but you can also give the model instructions for what does it look like even visually, and length and tone and all of those different kinds of things. It just makes Markdown is just an absolute game changer for making the outputs go from general to a lot more specific and a lot more alignment with you, with your business, and the principles that you've run your corporation on for years or decades.
Yeah, one before I switch back over to Chandler, because you're now getting into my operational world, right? So the what versus the how. And first of all, a question, because I don't know the answer to this, and hopefully you will, it can educate me and our listeners here. So I've heard a lot about skills, but primarily through Anthropic. Are you saying that the skills.md file or markdown file is present in the other LLMs as well?
I want to say it is, and if it isn't yet, it will be very soon on the other. It's most mature right now in Claude.
Okay. Yeah, so that's kind of what we're reading as well. Now, but here's my concern in this area. So to your point, if an organization has takes this seriously, takes all the guidance that you've been providing here on the podcast, and creates those skills.markdown files, then they're ahead of the game and they're going to get a high value out of AI. However, to produce those skills.markdown files, someone has to create those. Someone has to do that work. And I know from nearly 40 years of experience that people hate writing stuff down. They hate defining their processes. They hate defining their disciplines. If companies did that as a routine, then we have a lot less dysfunction in the world. And so even when you're looking at creating a quote unquote AI employee, it takes quite a bit of documentation behind the scenes to dictate how that employee is supposed to operate. Now, what they're doing is they're using AI to create a version 1, which nobody reads, right? And then suddenly that becomes now the doctrine in which this AI is going to operate against. Same thing could happen in a skills file. And so my concern is, how do you get that level of detailed discernment review so that we don't have the bad data or the sludge in our system? What would you recommend?
Well, you can start, it's kind of crawl, walk, run, right? So you can start basic with, if you have some mission, vision, values, and that are already written down, boom. You just put your mission, vision, values in your skills.md, and you can just kind of build it out from there. And I think in some ways, the new tools might force new conversations. And, in terms of, and that might be the A, in the, getting that alignment. And then once you get that alignment of like, hey, what do we want to have, in here? And then you can reckon with it. Once you reckon with it, you put that stuff, there, in that back end. There's also ways, let's say, because you also want to avoid groupthink, right? So if you go too heavy on that, you might end up cutting yourself off from ideas that would have been important or might have been contrarian, that you actually needed those contrarian ideas to sharpen you, kind of like, some lower grit sandpaper that, rubs your ideas and stress tests them. So if you're listening to this and you're playing around with any agentic systems, you can also build and spin up agents whose job it is to really be contrarian and poke holes in all of your ideas. And that can be a good thing, as well. Or you can even build that into your markdown of just like, okay, I want you to tell me what you think based on, the long obedience that this corporation has had and its core principles. But also, at the end of these things, I want you to stress test, everything that you send me and give me, give me some stuff that, gives me some friction and points out problem areas where it might be. So you can put all that stuff in there too.
Chandler, I was just going to apologize. Being a helicopter aviator, it took us down to 5 feet. Once you take us back up to a couple of flight levels and get us back into more strategic thinking and vision.
No, I think the 5 feet is an execution tactical level is important. I think that it does mix, as Michael did a great job from going almost theoretical, because also, the idea of layers and mixture of experts and building these markdowns, they're making the answers, and you hinted at this, so I'm going up and back down, make the answers easier to test and more intelligible, but they pound them back into the deterministic world. So you close that aperture down, and you don't see dimensionality or commonality across something that might be done in another industry, another domain, another, even field of study if you're doing research. And so, how do you oscillate? I like your idea of putting in the markdowns of having, I don't know if I like counterfactuals, because sometimes the AIs seem to spit those out no matter what, even if they're silly. Do you lean more towards, hey, if I have given you a markdown and I ask you to keep it within this scope and it looks right, but you see a higher probability pattern that's not in this that I should take note of, put that in there. How do you handle that from a practical, knowing how the AI is kind of functioning, at least on the newer models?
Well, if you have a multi-agent system, one of the things that some people have found to be helpful, and these are emergent technologies. So, but when you're spinning up teams of agents, it's always good to basically on every, so let's say you're a corporation and you have somebody who's basically running your agentic systems. Well, and let's say you have 2 or 3 agents in finance, you've got, say, 2 agents in legal, 4 agents in marketing. You always want, anytime you're building an agent, you're building an entire backstory for each person. They have a job description, they have processes and workflows, they have, you're writing what the output of what they should have look like. And so you always want to, and you're basically creating personas. And so when you're creating personas for stuff like this, it's like, well, you're essentially writing stories like, hey, you're an agent, you've got 20 years, working at one of the big 4 consulting firms, or, your expertise is in, such and such field, you're good at this kind of auditing. And when you write all that stuff into your kind of the agentic backstory for that particular agent, what it does is it actually really helps that agent do his job a lot better, because what you're telling the model is, I don't want all the training data. I want you to hone in to this agent has a skill set that's, in this very, very, it's drawing from a sliver of what's out there. But that sliver ends up being highly valuable for what that role is. And so sometimes having more parameters in a model is bad, because it hurts the ability for that particular seat to do its job. And so this is where, and again, spinning up teams of agents, this is not simple. This is like 301, type stuff, and this is, you're in the run territory of crawl, walk, run. Okay. But there are ways to do these kinds of things. And so anytime you have a team, when you have a sub team of agents, you always want to have one agent whose job is to basically fact check the other agents and send back their work multiple times before that work ever ends up on a human's plate in order to judge it.
So you get some sub-agents whose work is being checked by another agent, let's say an orchestrator, whatever word you want to use for it. But what is it using as the determination of whether or not the information that the sub-agent gave it is indeed valid? It needs to be kicked back for rework, because it sounds like it needs to know what the sub-agents know. And if that's the case, aren't we just making it more difficult for it to determine whether or not something is good or bad?
Well, a lot of times these models are incentivized to minimize token usage and take shortcuts, shortcuts electrically, shortcuts with compute. And so you have to create those fact-checking agents to almost counteract the ways in which there's token throttling from the models. Because what you have to realize with Claude is, from an ARR standpoint, they went 9x from January 1 to March 31st. I'm not sure if I can think of a corporation in the history of capitalism whose ARR has gone 9x and where the starting point was already in the billions. in a single quarter. And so they have outrun their compute ability over that time frame, and so they have to solve that some way, and they're doing that through through throttling some of the compute. And so you need to have those fact checking agents. And again, you have to write the skills into each individual agent, and the writing of the skills is what takes a model that's very general and turns it into, and where something is trained on something that's very general, and you want to say, no, I actually want you to be trained on something very, very specific. And so when you write the personas for each individual agent seat, that is what allows, the agent that's doing the kind of grunt work, and where they're kind of doing more of the technician stuff, for the manager to come in with a different skill set, fact check it, send it back before you have the human in the loop.
A couple of points on that. I mean, really, it seems like Scott brought it up. We in business want to get back. We want to go to work. Everyone wants to go straight to operations, go to work. But similar to your talking about supply and demand, and knowledge being get to work, tactical execution, wisdom going the other way is the wisdom to build these things out properly, because I like to say you're animating something. So you're bringing it to life in some sense. And so if you don't put the effort into bringing it to life in a way that is thoughtful and in alignment, like we talked about, with your values, you're going to create a bigger mess. And so that shift is tough in business. And so the doers and the linear thinkers want to get to work. And what you're saying is the shift is really going to the planner, the people above in strategy, or, even, I guess, coordination to strategy. But, there's people above that need to do a lot of homework, which requires talking to those lower level people on what really mattered. And so that shift is interesting. How do you see that shift in the management world or all of society?
The shift is from specialist to generalist. Let me explain that. So I'm 44, middle-aged, and almost my entire life has the economy and the people who've done best for themselves, who aren't entrepreneurs, so who have an employer. It's always been specialists. So it's been doctors, lawyers, accountants, software engineers, and those are all specialists. But how did those people become specialists? They went and got very specific education. What was beneath that education? It was very specific books. What did those books contain? They contained words. And so you became an expert based on words, and you end up getting extra income because of your ability to understand all of those words and to be able to use them correctly and apply them. Well, the problem is that large language models can now do that basically better than what humans can. And they can digest way more words than what humans can. So the problem is that specialists are more in trouble, because the way that the technology functions creates a hardship, and the moat, the intellectual moat that was there because you had read all of these things, is shrinking. And so the future, and at least in the AI future, belongs to generalists. It belongs to people who can zoom out, see the bigger picture, and who can function between all the different silos, and who can make sinew, ligaments, connective tissue between them, create multidisciplinary insights, find inefficiencies, and then use the tool to eliminate those inefficiencies. And I mean, it's no different than like kind of almost like the Toyota production method, and that kind of systems thinking, but applied intellectually, broadly speaking, not to just like warehouses or industrial engineering. And so really the future belongs to generalists. This is good news for somebody like me, who's always been like a jack of multiple trades, but never like a master of any single one. And so the future really belongs to systems thinkers and people who can architect what are the biggest things that we're trying to solve? What are the ways that we can use these tools to expedite that? And then how do we, operationalize all of that with and keep up with all the new all the new iterations, because it's like Anthropic's, shipping something new pretty much every day.
Yeah.
So, and you really the seats that you need in your corporation are changing rapidly. Whatever worked 3 months ago or 6 months ago, 12 months ago is now different. And so, if you're sitting in that top seat, you have to do a new audit almost every 90 days of what are the seats that we need? What do we need out of each of those seats? And it's almost like job descriptions need, instead of being updated once per year, they probably need updated twice per year. And probably within a year or two, they probably need to be updated almost quarterly. And so, and there also needs to be the question, really, in any job description, to what extent, how has the advancement in technology changed this job description? And then corporations also need to begin retooling and reskilling their people. And that's going to be hard for some people because sometimes, especially, when you get to be middle-aged and above, you're an old dog and you don't want to learn new tricks. But welcome to capitalism. Capitalism, you can't survive unless you're, an old dog that learns new tricks. Because as you get older, your ability to execute in terms of on the technician level, it wanes. It wanes from energy or cognitive decline. But what does grow is wisdom. Well, guess what? Good news. Wisdom's become more valuable. And so you have to really, stay up on, okay, how have these tools changed? How are they changing today? And then what does that mean for every seat, in this corporation? And if you're not maximizing some of those efficiencies, then creative destruction is probably right around the corner on some level.
Yeah, and I want to attempt to put this into something where Scott can probably give us book names very quickly. So some of this seems so 301 to your point and so far out there. But if you actually think about Scott, as I don't know if we've covered on the podcast, he's 400 to 600 business books, read threads. So he's going to love your book on the thin thread because that's his favorite thing to do. But really, I think EOS, which Scott can explain, accountability charts, which are way different than, to your point, org charts and job descriptions. So basically, you take a seat that has a function. In the EOS model, it would have been up to 5 functions. With agents, it probably needs to max out at about 3. And we have expanded that to, right, here's an activity, there's a seat that creates this activity. Here are the 3 things it does. Here's the KPIs, that leading indicators on KPIs for that. Build those out, which you can do in your business now. Start thinking about, hey, this problem occurred. Okay, well, what if I had a person in theory, which will then become probably an agent, but we don't need to go in that seat, and they had 3 responsibilities max? How would we know they were doing their job in a leading way? You can start documenting that. That's a lot different than what do I have now, to your point, which has to change, and what do I think it should be? That's almost a human version of a workflow. And so the workflows, one of the things you can speak to, we can map our workflow, we can map the accountability chart, we can map the people, we can map their job descriptions. All those jobs aren't necessary. A lot of those jobs aren't necessary because we're going to get more efficient. It's because humans had to put checkpoints in there that AI doesn't. And so we build them. But when you brought up your building agents and counter agents, 6 thinking hats, Scott. So if you think EOS, 6 thinking hats, there are some structures that really would help a business person wrap their head around which is very complicated tech and AI. But what tools do we already have? What research is already done in organizational and business development that we can apply? And you kind of build your way up. And where we started, if you haven't built out your values, if you haven't built out the purpose of the business, and you haven't built out the waypoints, the next quarter, 6 months, your 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, and sort of your big, hairy, audacious goal of going to Collins, you haven't given context to the AI or the agents. Some of this you can get ahead of the curve despite how tech speeds up. So, Scott, can you think from your operational actual deployment, just some analogous books or systems that are in business that may map over to what Michael has been great of explaining to us of how the actual tech and AI are going?
Yes, absolutely. And first of all, Michael, thank you. You've given me new hope that, 27 plus cross-functional certifications may be useful to someone here in the future. So that's good news. Now, one of the things that we talk about in the Helmwise methodology is something we call shipworks. And through my reading of a variety of different books, as Chandler has mentioned, it comes down to 5 what I call red threads, right? You got to have a culture, right? You've got to have some way in which you're selecting, and in some cases, deselecting people. You got to have disciplines or processes. You got to have measures to make sure that you actually are getting closer to your objective rather than further away. And then finally, most importantly, you need communication. But what you just mentioned is critically important, because one of the things that underpins that entire model is change management, right? The people aspect, not the project management, the actual tools and processes and procedures, but how do we get people aligned? Make sure that the mission hasn't changed, making sure that the values and culture haven't been eroded as we try to chase the next shiny object. So it comes down to having a framework in which you're operating in. EOS offers a great framework, scaling up. You can have Pinnacle, you can have Business Made Simple, great game of business, 4DX, you could have MDM, you could have a lot of different things, right? But the bottom line is you've got to function within that system. In the system, you got to be disciplined enough to keep on going through the iterations. Because one of the things we also talk about in the Helmwise methodology is what we call seasonality. And so we've studied it and seen seasonality from a variety of different ways. Some people will generally say, what season is your business in? Is it startup? Is it in the growth phase? Is it in maturity, or is it in decline? Well, but what about that person within that system, right? Are they just starting out their career, or are they an old dog, as you mentioned? Right? Where are they in the industry? Are they a veteran of the industry, or are they new to the industry, or somewhere in between? Where are they in terms of their role? Are they used to being an individual contributor and now they're a team manager, or maybe even an executive? And it's this kaleidoscope of all these different seasonalities that you need to constantly assess to figure out what do we need. And then once you decide that, to your point, define the seats and define what you need from the seats, then how you actually affect the change. And that's where change comes in, whether it's ProSize AdCar or any of the other frameworks that are out there. So this time we're in is very interesting to me, because a lot of these things are coming back to roost. The need for values, the need for a culture, the need for good people, adaptive people, growth mindset, if you go to Carol Dweck, or a framework, or the ability that you've got to consider not just the technical side, but the people side. And so this is a very dynamic time, and it's funny that we think that AI is making things easier. In my opinion, it's starting to make things much more complex. Your thoughts, Michael?
There's something here that I want to, everybody who's, a decision maker and somebody who's making hires, who's listening to this, there's something that you need to know. There is a person who's going to be the most important hire that you will need to make in the next 3 to 12 months. And every corporation is going to need at least one of this person. And there's going to be a race to make this hire across every SMB to Fortune 500 company and everything in between. And that person is the person who is excellent at spinning up agents. And this person needs to be very much up to speed on whatever the latest is. They probably need to be working and most familiar with the Claude system. Anthropic is probably 9 to 10 months ahead of Gemini and GPT, and probably 12 months ahead of China. This person They need to be a systems thinker. They need to be able to deeply understand just about every aspect of your business. They definitely have to be a generalist. And they should be also a tinkerer. They're somebody who is constantly tinkering. In their evening, they're playing around with this stuff because they like it and because it's fun to them. Okay? So this is a very specific and very unique person. And the problem that you're going to have is that if you wait too long to make this hire, there are not going to be very many of these people out there, because the skill set required to do this job is going to be very, very rare. And the best of them will be gobbled up very soon. And so even if you are yet to have thought through an agentic framework for your company, you probably need to go out and make this hire before the quality of the people that you can get is depreciates significantly.
Michael, do you think that has to be a single person, or can you assemble a team with deep skill sets? Like I said, maybe someone who understands the technical details of how to create an agent, but you've got someone who understands the systems aspects to understand how that agent must interact with sub-agents. And so, because your point, to find that individual as a single individual, wow, that's going to be a needle in a haystack, in my opinion, unless you've come across these people more frequently than I have.
You can find these folks. They're about 1 in 50 or 1 in 100 people. They exist now. They haven't been gobbled up. I have a few on my radar. I'm trying to convince my own organization to make said hire while it's still possible. Can you cobble together a team of people who collectively might be able to say, hey, from our department, hey, if you put together, a team of agents, here's the different agents that you would want, and here's the personas that you'd have for each. Here's how we need to adjust the job descriptions of the people who are on our team as some of that work, gets offloaded. Yes, you could probably put some of that together, but at some point you will need, so the wisdom part of that seat might be able to be, the wisdom there might already exist on your teams. But what's missing is probably going to be the technician piece, and somebody who has the technical skill. And particularly if your field involves any level of data security, compliance, all of those kinds of things, or if these agents need to be air gapped and have, no access to the internet, that kind of stuff, those skills are not going to probably exist on your pre-existing teams unless you're a medium or large sized organization.
Right.
And maybe there are people who are listening to this that, that fit in that category.
Well, the interesting part on the data, so I've actually done a lot of data on this one. So the systems thinkers are about 5% of the population. Half of those do not like organized education. They don't like organized business. They're not going to be in that realm. So you cut that to 2.5%. And then if you add other attributes behind it, like you just did, they're way less than 1%. They're in the 0.%. The other interesting data point, Harvard did a study on this. They call it the squeaky wheel. So they found them. It had nothing to do at that time with systems thinking or the paradigm shift that's occurring now. But it was the kind of ideal person that is looking, they're in the meeting saying, well, why didn't that silo work here? And they're seeing all these things that AI could do. They have dimensionality and systems thinking. Overwhelmingly, the immune system of that organization, 90+% of the time, fired them. So their answer is not to actually hire them. Their answer is to fire them. And so when you say a mid-size or large business, I kind of chuckle because the immune system is way higher in those organizations for silo process, put you in a box. Those CEOs, which if you're one of them, humility is actually the fear of the Lord. So it might not be a lot, but you need to humble yourself enough to either hire a systems thinker that Michael's talking about and realize you don't have it, which means you're going to rock the boat big time and you're highly deterministic. Most large CEOs, you look up the stats, mid and large size, are extremely good at finding something that works, eliminating all noise, all obstacles, and driving it to maximize the value. That is pretty much the opposite description of what you just laid out. And so it'll be an interesting paradigm shift in that regard. So
here's how you find this person. They probably have a liberal arts background and not a business background. But you then take all the liberal arts people into the top of the funnel. And then what you're looking for at the bottom of the funnel is liberal arts plus systems thinking. When you're looking at your resumes, you're looking for somebody who's been tinkering with agentic AI, and not just tinkering with it, but like they derive life and energy, and this is like what's driving them, and this is how they're spending their free time. That's how you find that person.
They understand they're animating something. So the idea of animating these agents and these systems is exciting because they do run. And so that's something that draws them for sure. And so it'll be interesting. If you don't believe Michael's correct, and that's correct, go look at Palantir, who is constantly testing, looking for what they're calling divergent thinkers and giving them fellowships. They're just paying them to come there with the opportunity to go up. And so they've already got the funnel that they're trying to fill from the top and gobble up as many of these people as possible. There's a couple studies that came out of, I believe it was Northwestern and one of the College of London maybe, that tested systems thinkers versus non-systems thinkers, both high performers with AI. So if you think they're just like they're an A+ player specialist, you give them AI and they're going to keep up. A lot of this data is showing up in GitHub early on GitHub. They looked at 50,000 programmers there. The B and C players who are systems thinkers are leapfrogging a lot of your A players because A players controlled everything. And so I will kind of close on this. There's a fishing boat that does marlin offshore fishing, and the name of the boat is Sea Student. And so it's a multi-billion-dollar, crazy fishing operation. And, I would bet you very strong money that Sea Student is exactly why that person has been successful. But it doesn't function well usually in the immune system of your business if it is too rigid and too contracted. Even if you find them, you'll spit them right back out. And so you do have to change your culture, change the way you view the world, and then find some alignment. My last question for you is, how do you keep your true north, we'll call it, personally? And then, so these leaders, as they're trying to, they're going to enter into, as we know, complete change. I mean, the gap between where we are now to the AI-enabled future has a whole nother 10 podcasts of scariness in between. But how do you keep yourself aligned personally and in business?
Yeah, so for me, it's one closed fist and one open hand. So, the closed fists are the sum total of things that are bounded set. So in set theory, there's bounded set and center set. So bounded set are all the things that have to exist in a very defined border. In other words, there's a fence. Mm-hmm. Center set is kind of like the idea of, okay, so in Australia, sheep farmers, they don't have to put up fences. All they have to do is they put a well with a water source, and the sheep don't stray too far from the water source. So that's center set thinking. So the bounded set is the closed fist. The center set is the kind of the more open. So we have to have this balance of, okay, who am I? What am I about? What are my principles? What are my values? What virtues, am I living for? And so, for me, all of that stuff goes back to, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and everything that can be found, in the Christian worldview. So that's the true north for me. And the beautiful thing about that is I don't have to, I actually think that like this man did all these things, and I actually believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and if this guy did this and and that he was God, it changes everything. And I'm a skeptic at heart, so it's kind of miraculous in some ways that like I believe any of this, because I'm somebody who's just not super inclined to just believe things. So I'm kind of that Thomas skeptic of like show me kind of thing. And so the true north for me is, I really do, I believe that that God exists. I believe that, there's two ways to deal with the problem of, of sin or evil in the world. And one model of that is basically karma, and, in self-righteousness, I can try to white knuckle it and do all that stuff myself. Or, in the Christian model is, God says that, that's not possible, because I'm holy and you're not. And so you don't even have in your essence the ability to cross that gap, because the gap between you and me is infinite. And so, so for me, that's kind of the true north, which frees me to, I don't have to, I'm not relying on my own righteousness. I'm relying on the righteousness of Christ. But the beautiful thing about that is, for me, is like, he doesn't just leave us where we're at. He gives us new desires. And so when he gives us that new heart, then that new heart comes with new desires. And that's where, the growth in virtues and principles can begin to grow, because you have, a new heart that has new desires, and those new desires end up aligning with, with God's values, and you end up treating neighbor as you would yourself. And so that's the true north for me. So, but those print, so that's kind of like the closed fist of like, that's who I am. This is what I'm about. But then the open hand is, okay. And this goes back to like general revelation, that's special revelation. This is general revelation, the open hand, going back to kind of my epistemological grid. And so what does it look like to navigate culture, society, commerce, the invisible hand of the marketplace? What is all the new information? How are things, changing and growing and evolving? It takes a lot to just kind of keep up with all of those things. And so you have to create space in your life to be a lifelong learner and somebody who's constantly evolving, because and this goes back to really just like almost like the Greeks of, well, is it being or is it becoming? And that's the big question in the West is, is it Plato or is it Aristotle, or is it Socrates, or, is it being or becoming? And the reality is it's both, right? Mm-hmm. You have to have your core principles, your closed fist, and then you have to have your flexibility of what's changing over time. And so, having a nice balance between those two things and letting those two things mutually inform each other, in cross-pollinating and kind of ways, I think is important.
Outstanding. So, Michael, as we wrap, I want to give you a minute or three to talk about the Keller Center, maybe even the Gospel Coalition, or even your AI Christian benchmark, and just let our listeners know if they want more information, where they can find that information.
How you can think about the Gospel Coalition is the Gospel Coalition exists to help resource local churches around the world. And so what we try to do is we try to, if you go to like Home Depot or Lowe's, and let's say you got a crack in your masonry somewhere, and you need to go get that expanding spray foam. You spray it in the crack, and then you restucco over it, right? That's basically the Gospel Coalition. We find cracks in the masonry where churches here or abroad, because they don't have either time, money, or expertise, and there's some kind of missing resource that's there, we exist to go spray our expanding spray foam in that crack. And so we're not trying to reduplicate anything that any seminary is doing, or anything that any local church or even denomination is doing, or any other, creator of resources. And we're trying to do all of those resources and put them out there at no expense. So how you can think about the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics inside of the Gospel Coalition, and that's the department that I work in at TGC, is we're basically the R&D department of TGC. So our mandate, and the big knock on evangelicals is this: we're always 5, 10, 15, 20 years behind, the big conversations in culture and society. So the Keller Center exists to try to bring Christians up to speed, at least on conversations that are occurring today, if not be thinking a year or two ahead of the big conversations that are kind of coming down the pike. So for us, a lot of the conversations that we're having right now, are around this area of helping Christians around the world what does it look like for us to use AI redemptively? And how do we help the people who are in our churches get reskilled and retooled as, this new industrial revolution, this new Gutenberg printing press, and this new type of almost electricity? It's almost like all three of those technologies are being put on mankind, but all at once, and in this, not just the same century, but the same year. And so, the democratizing force, the way that knowledge is accelerated, and the way that the workforce is being, kind of reworked all at once is certainly it's a massive event in human history, perhaps one of the single largest inflection points in human history. So our focus right now is very much focused on how do we help people navigate that difference redemptively.
Outstanding. Chandler, any final words?
No, I think you did a wonderful job. I certainly appreciate the time and the discussion. It's been good to learn from you, and I hope that folks can take the wonderful advice you gave, make it practical, something that Scott is expert at. And as we try to take things that seem only in the religion realm, understand that they are influencing the way we have to change our leadership, our culture, the way these AIs are actually functioning. They have values. They have their own sets that are filtering. The people dealing with them have those. You must be aware in order to be wise. And so, our goal is to make sure that wisdom, we put a little piece of that, hopefully, on this podcast and through Helmwise. And I thank you for joining us on this endeavor.
Thanks. It's been great to be here. And if you want to stay in touch, I'd love to stay in touch with you. If you found anything here that's valuable, you can go to thekellercenter.org. And right there on our homepage is, a place to sign up for our email newsletter, where we let everybody know about, the free resources that we're creating. So all that's at thekellercenter.org.
Yeah, Michael, I am deeply grateful for your time. I've learned so much from you. I've got probably 2.5 pages of notes here. There are a lot of things I've got circled. I'm going to go research. So I just learned so much. I appreciate your time, your insights, your expertise. And we want to ensure that people do go out and leverage your Christian benchmark and also find out more about the Keller Center. So thank you very much. And we'll be speaking to our audience here soon with our next interview as we continue this series as we talk about wisdom in the age of AI. So thank you all and have a great day. Cheers.